everyone, and thank you for tuning in to my channel today. I have as a guest Dan Kavic. He's a friend from the East Coast who's been helping me with the Trad Recovery website as an administrator, and he's doing a wonderful job with so many things. He's a former traditionalist, and he's sharing his story with us a little bit today and a lot more about the reintegration process of coming back into the Catholic Church and how that went. So everyone, welcome Dan. And how are you doing today, Dan?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Awesome. So, a little background. We start when you were little.
Yeah, we could start. We could talk about my days growing up with the new mass.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So yeah, I was raised. I was born in 1984, so I grew up in the middle of the papacy of John Paul II, and the new mass was obviously the dominant liturgical rite in the West at that point. So, I'm very familiar with the Novus Ordo Mass, growing up with it, and going to mass every week with my parents. And I guess luckily for me, I never had experienced any like liturgical abuses that I saw growing up with the Novus Ordo Mass. So I guess I was just lucky in that regard. But it's something that now, being a former, I guess, trad, if you want to call it that, I look back on it now and I'm thinking, well, okay, I'd grown up in it and attended so many masses during the years with my parents, and then going through the whole journey that we talked about on the Logos project. If anyone didn't see my interview on there, just a quick recap for everybody. I had gone through pretty much all the trad groups that you can name, except the old Catholics. I was never an old Catholic, but that was due to me trusting a lot of people that were very passionate about their faith. And I get it. They just were very passionate about the position. Some of them grew up in those groups. So I'd gone through the SSPX, Sedevacantism at one point, and then back into the Catholic Church, of course, last year. So it's been quite a journey. But if you have any questions, Laura, that you feel free to ask as far as my growing up in the Novus Ordo Mass. I had poor catechism, I'll admit, as a kid, growing up and going through the CCD program. It was just a very generic, like vanilla / cookie cutter kind of CCD program,
Oh no.
So, I'll admit, I actually know more about the faith now that I'm older than I did when I was 15, 16. Like I barely knew anything about it, really. I knew who the saints were, obviously Jesus and Mary, the basics of the faith, but nothing really in depth. That, as far as Vatican II, I didn't know really anything about Vatican II.
Yeah.
So, growing up with, you grew up in, it's kind of like no one really discusses it. At least the parish I grew up in, I never heard anyone really talk about the council. It was kind of like, all right, it happened, that's it.
Yeah. Well, for most Catholics, I mean, wouldn't you say that is not like it was a blip on the screen? I mean, that's a little understated, but most people, and media wasn't as available as it is now, and the internet and stuff. So it's not like they were following every iota of it. They were just like, well, it's going on and it'll affect us somehow. But I feel like it was more just kind of a bump in the road for a lot of people.
It just seems for some people, they don't even know what Vatican II was. They don't even know that it was a church council. They have no idea. So, that's just every parish varies, obviously. During my trad days, as we'll call it, I'd kind of look down upon other people that grew up in the Novus Ordo, because I'm thinking, okay, well, some of these Novus Ordo parishes, they don't really catechize the people that well. The priests, some of them are, they're very good-will priests, but they just don't want to spend a lot of time or effort, because they have other things going on as far as catechism goes. And I kind of look down on other people, and unfortunately, I regret that now. But I was thinking, well, okay, the Novus Ordo, as we'll call it, they don't really have consistency, and that's the one thing I will admit that you see in the trad circles is a lot of consistency, at least from catechist point of view. I have to admit it's kind of embarrassing when I went to a Sedevacantist mass one time. After the mass, there were a bunch of little 5-year-olds in the social hall naming off like more saints than I could remember, and telling like what they did. It was kind of impressive, actually, I will admit.
Yeah.
But, you see that sort of thing happening in these trad circles, and it's kind of like that's where I think part of the arrogance, if you want to call it that, kind of comes in, and looking down and pointing the fingers at other Catholics out there that attend the regular Novus Ordo or ordinary form, as Pope Benedict named it. But we could talk about that if you want. I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head of a lot of things I kind of regret now that during that transition period when I went from ultra trad to I guess regular Catholic now. I guess it's
just plain old. Oh no! Yeah, we don't have any special handles anymore, huh?
I know, right? You're right. During that transition period, it was hard for me actually because I had to learn to let go and trust the church. I recall from your interview with Mr. Bartel, he kind of said something similar where you kind of go through this transition period where it's kind of like putting your foot back in the water. You're sitting at the side of a pool and you're kind of dipping your foot in the water again, so to speak, to kind of ease yourself back in.
Yeah.
And it took me a while actually because I had read so much stuff about Vatican II online that a lot of it was just negative. I mean, I have to admit, the majority of it was like a comparison. I mean, you'd have these charts that people put together of, what happened before the council, what happened after, and then they have pictures of the churches where what they looked like with the high altar, and then the newer churches and that were built in like the 70s and 80s, how they look kind of different. Making these sort of apples and oranges kind of comparisons. So a lot of that, I guess, brainwashing, if you want to call it that, or reprogramming of my mind, I had to kind of undo it slowly.
Right.
And that was definitely a process. And, one part of it too was actually going to the diocesan Latin Mass, like I kind of talked about in the interview with Dom and Dr. John Salza. I had to, I actually sat out in the vestibule for the first time I went in because, as a trad, you're programmed to think, okay, well, this is evil. If I go inside, I'm actually adhering to this so-called new religion, right?
Oh no, yeah.
But that's what happens. You're kind of programmed to say, okay, it's safe for me to be out in the vestibule because I'm not actually in the chapel, but I can still observe what's kind of happening. And there'd be people coming out, with their kids, and they'd look at me and they'd be like, "What's this guy doing out here?" They're probably like,
"You don't have a baby."
Yeah, I didn't have any kids. I didn't bring my kids with me for that whole, that whole process, if you want to call it that.
Right.
And I was observing it, and then eventually I got the guts to actually go in and sit in like the very far back pew in the chapel. Watch the mass, and I was careful about not praying because I'm like, well, would I? Is it just passive participation if I'm just kind of standing up and sitting down? As you're kind of told, well, if you have to go to a, let's say a non-Catholic service for like a funeral, right? So the Sedevacantist priest from Akron, Ohio, that I had gotten close with back in 2016, he actually told me that it was actually sinful to participate. So you could go to, let's say, like an Orthodox funeral, right? But you have to just kind of like be passive. Like you can just stand up and sit down when the rest of the, the congregation does, but that's it. Like you can't do anything else.
Okay.
So it was kind of like that with my first couple masses that I went to at the Institute of Christ the King, the diocesan Latin masses. But then slowly I started to say, well, okay, or at least ask myself, what is the Catholic Church? Because you're taught in these circles like the SSPX and the Sedevacantist circles that they're the ones keeping the true faith. They're the ones they're the remnants of what's left of the Catholic Church, right? In the modern day. And I had to tell myself, okay, well, what does Blessed Pius IX, say about the Catholic Church? There's a very well-known quote from him where he says that it's the pillar and ground of truth, without neither spot nor wrinkle. And I was thinking about that quote as I'm sitting through these masses, and I'm starting to realize, okay, this is actually the Catholic Church that's this diocesan mass is part of the diocese.
Yeah.
Answer to the local bishop. But I had to like deprogram myself because I actually thought at one point that the local bishop wasn't even a real bishop.
Oh, yeah, right.
Ordained after 1975, with the
Yeah.
new ordination rite. So
Right.
whenever you go through that whole ordeal, you have people telling you that these ordination rites are invalid. I mean, John Falza can explain any of that better than me as far as like the society's position on all that. But
yeah,
they don't encourage people to go to the new mass, obviously, as you're very familiar with. And they kind of make it as if it's like toxic, like you can't really trust that the ordinations are possibly valid in some cases because the bishop was ordained after a certain year. But the Sedevacantist will tell you, okay, if the bishop was ordained after or before 1969, then yeah, the bishop's actually valid and those ordinations might be valid, but because they're in union with Rome, they're part of a false religion.
Oh gosh.
So it's just all this programming that went,
Yeah.
into my mind over the years between, different sedes that I talked to, priests, many priests actually that I had emailed or spoken to on the phone. They kind of reinforced that. So I had to tell myself, okay, they're the ones that aren't actually valid. They're the ones who are actually operating independently without a mandate. And that's what I had to, go through in my mind and remind myself, kind of reinforce it. And it was tough because, part of you wants to kind of like go back to that safe trad circle, if you want to call it that. That safe zone in your mind where you're thinking, okay, this is traditional, so this must be safer, right? But that's actually not the case. So you have to kind of fight your mind.
Oh man, that's really rough.
Well, yeah, it took me about roughly a year to really be comfortable. I gradually got more and more comfortable as it went on, going to the diocesan Latin masses, even going to the Eastern rites. There were some things like I went to a Maronite Catholic mass at one point to see what that was about. And, they do the peace handshake. The rest of their liturgy is pretty much traditional as far as the structure, but they added in the peace handshake, that they have in the new mass. And, I had seen that, and I actually was kind of scandalized at first when I saw it. I was like, oh, they actually brought the peace handshake back for this.
Yeah. PTSD. Oh no.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Yeah. So you have to really kind of go through this. It's almost like I guess the way I describe it is kind of like a dark forest that you're kind of like guiding yourself with a little lantern, and you're trying to figure out, okay, well, how do I get out of this place, and get back to the sunny green forest, so to speak,
Yeah.
So it was a process for sure. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'm just kind of just thinking off the top of my head as I go back and remember it all.
No, I think this is good.
Yeah, so it's one of those things too where I had spent a lot of time talking with the Eastern Rite priests, because I go to a Ukrainian Catholic church that's really close to my house right now. And even though I'm technically Western by jurisdiction, because they're in union with Rome, I can still go there and do confession, go there for Sunday obligation. I think it's sui juris is how you say it in Latin, that they're in union with Rome. So that legally allows you to go and, get the sacraments from them.
Yeah.
Whereas the Sedevacantists and SSPX masses are not in union with Rome. Even though they allow the confessions and the marriages at the SSPX, that's really all they can do there, as you're familiar with. So, but it was
not even fulfill your Sunday obligation, right?
You cannot. You're right. You cannot fulfill obligation, unfortunately. Even though I actually made the argument, I used to make the argument even to people at the diocesan Latin mass. I was like, would talk about the society, and one guy actually said to me, well, I can't go there because I'm afraid I'm going to lose my soul. And I said to him, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense as society. You can go there for mass on Sunday, but I didn't know at the time what John was saying about it. And even Tim Staples, I exchanged some emails with Tim Staples, and he was like, yeah, you can go. But then, I don't know if Tim's read a lot of John's work or if he's really caught up on all that. But
Mm-hmm.
after reading John's work, I was like, okay, yeah, this makes sense. You can't actually go there for Sunday Mass. So I kind of regret telling that guy.
Oh man,
he didn't go.
well, maybe he went and looked it up and found out what was really going on. So
yeah, but luckily that guy, I'd seen him go every week to the diocesan Latin Mass, so I don't think he's going to go to the society anyway.
Yeah.
But I kind of felt bad afterwards. I'm like, well, I wish I didn't tell him that. But you live and learn, right? You live and
and when you're so convicted about something and excited, the natural thing is to want to share it with people. That's the generous thing. But then when you realize later you were into something wrong, you're like, oh no, what did I do? How many other people did I lead astray? It's like, oh.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I have the regrets, with some of the things I said. And, the new Mass, again, going back to that, I actually had one woman from that same church say to me, well, isn't the Novus Ordo and the Latin Mass the same Mass? And at that time, I was still kind of going through that transition period. And I said to her, well, no, they don't really seem like they're the same. I mean, they're both legal or, approved by the church, but they're still different. I still had an aversion to the Novus Ordo Mass. I was still against it to a degree, if you want to put it that way. So, I tell people, well, if it's the only option that you have, then go. I mean, one of our own members on the Trad Recovery Forum actually had a discussion with me about that recently. And he was like, well, I don't know if I really feel comfortable going back to the Novus Ordo yet, even though I have really no other place that I can drive to that's within a reasonable distance, right?
Right.
So that dilemma comes up. And then I've seen some people online debating, okay, is it better to just stay home and pray a rosary? And I would actually say no, because you're actually intentionally missing Mass if you have an option near you that you can go to. And let's say you don't even like the Novus Ordo Mass. You just don't like that liturgy, right? It just doesn't appeal to you. It doesn't speak to you. Yeah. You could just go for the Offertory and then, stay for the whole consecration. And then you would technically be fulfilling that requirement in canon law for you to fulfill the obligation. See, a lot of people don't know that. They don't realize that even though it's not good to show up to Mass late, right? Certain things happen. So the church understands that. And they put things into place where if you showed up late, you missed the sermon. And as long as you were there for the full offertory and the full consecration, you actually fulfill the requirements for canon law to fulfill that obligation.
Oh,
so,
that is good to know.
That is good to know. I didn't even know it for a long period of time until I actually just did my own research on that. But it's helpful at least to say to someone, okay, look, if you don't like the Novus Ordo Mass for whatever reason, and you only have that as your option, to go for at least the offertory and the consecration.
Yeah.
It's better not to be late, obviously. I encourage people, don't miss the sermon, obviously, if you don't have to. But if that's like something that you're like, oh, look, I just can't stomach it. I can't sit through this whole thing, right? Because they've been programmed in trad world to think, okay, this is evil, or this is it's a bad option in a lot of people's minds. I'm telling them, like, look, that's the bare minimum, okay? If you don't like it, that's your choice. You don't have to like it. But as a Catholic, we have our Sunday obligation to fulfill.
Right. It's a precept of the church. You know, it's like you don't just get dispense from that unless you actually, I mean, if you seek an actual dispensation, that's one thing. But if you're just doing that on your own because you're judging, it's more important to, preserve yourself in some way to stay home. It's like, well, but then you're still believing that you're risking something by going to this thing that's been officially promulgated by the church and can't, by its nature, be harmful to your soul. Like, it may offend your preferences. It may throw you back to, the brainwashing or the bad experiences you had before, which is terrible. Like, we really feel for people that are having that struggle because we don't want them to be pushed too soon, before they're ready. But if like you're saying about these people that still have such an aversion to the Novus Ordo, it's like, well, you're just not done with your process of really coming home, because that's just part of the step. And you may never just love it to pieces, but if you can't be at peace with it, it's just kind of a red flag sign that you've still got some healing that needs to happen in your soul.
No, I totally agree. And, the other problem is too, for some people, they may never want to go back to it. You know, they like I see guys, I'm not going to name anyone specifically, but we have a SSPX apologist, especially online from Canada, that is telling people that he'd rather die than go to the Novus Ordo Mass, right? So you see people like that out there.
Yeah.
Saying these sort of things, and then everything that's happening with the I guess this motu proprio that's going to be coming up here soon in the future that everyone's rumoring. All these rumors are going about, about the Latin Mass getting shut down. That's not helping either, because then you have people out there that are just speaking out against Francis, and I keep seeing these 10-year anniversaries, right? Because if it's the 10th year of his pontificate.
Yeah.
These guys that have these different shows out there that are saying, well, okay, he's the worst pope ever, right? And they're just saying all these negative things about him. And I get where they're frustrated about, the things that are happening or whatever. But what that's doing is that's actually reinforcing that aversion to the Novus Ordo Mass then. Because people look at it and they say, well, you know what? Francis is going to shut down all the Latin Masses, right? And he's going to force everybody to go to the Novus Ordo.
Yeah.
But that's the problem. They don't understand that, like you said, it's a church-approved rite. And then I go back to that quote from Pius IX, that the church has neither spot nor wrinkle. It's the pillar and ground of truth, right?
Yeah.
So how could it give us something that is actually poison to our soul if it's actually been promulgated by a valid pope, Paul VI, even though at one time people really tried hard to get me to doubt that he was a true pope, right?
Yeah.
I was never fully sold on that, by the way. I was never fully sold that he wasn't a true pope.
Oh, okay.
I had doubts that I thought, well, maybe he lost office later on because of, introducing the new mass and, some of the other changes that happened over the years. But I never was fully convinced at that point that he wasn't a true pope, because his conclave was valid. Yeah. And you have a group out there called Sedevacantist. I don't know if you're familiar with them at all.
A little bit.
Yeah, know a little bit about them. They actually recognize the hierarchy, the modern hierarchy. They actually recognize it and say, okay, it's a valid hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
But it's kind of like president-elect, when you have a presidential election, the Pope, he gets elected by the valid conclave, but they're saying, okay, he doesn't actually become president, in this case, Pope. He's still Pope-elect. So there's that position out there, too, which adds more to the confusion.
Oh my gosh! Wow.
Yeah. So it's quite a mess that Archbishop Lefebvre was actually responsible for causing, if you think about it.
Yeah, it's like, ooh, did you have any idea what that was going to create? Oh my gosh! Yeah.
I know, and the Archbishop tried. He really, I think he really tried to be a holy man, and he really thought that he was doing the right thing. But when you look back on history and what John wrote, and going through it all, you're just like, okay, he was actually not the good guy in the story, really. I hate to use the villain. I don't want to say villain. He's not really a villain, I guess you could say, but he was the just a confused soul that really took it off the deep end. He went off the deep end.
Right. Yeah.
So,
he was very conflicted. Yeah.
He was very conflicted. But anyway, I don't want to go off track with all that. But I just want to give people an idea of like how much confusion can be out there, and then you have these people talking about Francis now and getting nervous about the Latin masses possibly being shut down, and I get why they're worried about it. Personally, I don't think it's a good idea for him to do that, but he's the Pope; he has the authority to do something like that, and as Catholics, we have to basically accept that he has that authority. And Bishop, I don't know if you've kept up with Bishop Athanasius Schneider, but recently he had said something to the degree that if Francis does this, then we're going to have to resist him, right?
Oh my goodness.
So he's actually adding more problems now to this whole situation.
Oh yeah.
People that are confused out there, because now they're looking at him and saying, well, okay, this is one of the more conservative Novus Ordo bishops, right? That's out there. Yeah. And I actually want to say something too about the whole Novus Ordo terminology. I think that it's actually it's unfortunate that Archbishop Lefebvre aggregated the Catholic Church. He actually, I think, did it intentionally, where he wanted people to really believe, okay, there's a new church, right? There's a new religion out there, a separate church from the actual Catholic Church, right? And I actually tell people now, there is no Novus Ordo church. There's a Novus Ordo liturgical rite, but there is no separate Novus Ordo church. We're in the Catholic Church. We are
Right.
just Catholics, right? So
Mhm.
I actually, I'll admit, I actually at one point used to call it the bogus Ordo. You know, that was my little fun way of, calling it a different
Yeah.
religion or different church. But
Right.
now when I look back on it, it's not the Novus Ordo. So when we hear the Novus Ordo Church, I'm really trying now to set this frame where I'm saying to people, there is no Novus Ordo. It's just always been the Catholic Church. Now, which
Right.
church is actually the Catholic Church versus these independent groups, like, the ones claiming they're the true church, right?
Right.
So
Right.
I'm trying to kind of change that attitude now, and it's going to be a long project, if you want to call it that, to try to convince people, okay, there is no Novus Ordo church. It's just the
That's
Catholic Church.
really good point. I mean, because our terms are so important, even if like we know what we mean, but we still use these words and then you give them power by using them. Or you're sort of, making a concession to whoever coined that phrase
Archbishop
by
Lafayette.
using their term.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the Novus Ordo liturgy, I mean, it was a new ordering, but by now, I mean, okay, I know 60 years is nothing in the span of the church's life, but it's really kind of silly to call it new anymore. I mean, it's had 60 years to go around the block. It's just the Roman Rite. And, then it's like that was a previous form of the Roman Rite, which is still being permitted in certain cases. But it's not like they're at variance with each other, or that, one is new and the other one's old. And it's like the other one is old, but there's things in it that aren't as old as they would seem to be. I mean, that's another thing that people, if they don't educate themselves very well historically about the liturgy and how it came to be what it is, they just think, oh, well, this, like, they'll say stuff. I've heard people say stuff like, well, this, the TLM, it's the same liturgy that our Lord and the apostles offered. And I'm like, really? I mean, no. I mean, how can you construe that? You read the Last Supper account in the Gospels, right? It looked totally different. I mean, there was, the words of institution and the species and things there, but it's been in a long process of evolution and a lot of accretions that it gained, especially in the Middle Ages, and the kind of the courtliness, and it's got a very Western medieval courtly feel, which is fine because that's where it was, very much cultivated. But it's like that, it didn't just pop up out of the ground like that. And the Novus Ordo, the 1970 promulgation, it didn't pop out of the ground either, and it's actually more traditional in some ways than the 1962. But that's hard for people to swallow if they haven't been looking all into that themselves and they've been just being fed these lines.
You're right. No, you're absolutely right. And they think everything that was introduced with the Novus Ordo rite is a novelty. They have no idea that communion in the hand was actually a practice. I mean, you actually mentioned the Last Supper, right? And some people will say, "Oh, this is a weak argument." Our Lord actually hands the apostles the bread, right?
Yeah.
He's handing them the bread he consecrated himself
Right.
at the Last Supper.
They're
So,
probably facing each other. They're
well, yeah.
sitting
So
around a
you're having
table. They're
communion in the
in
hand,
a
right?
room of somebody's house. I mean, it's in Aramaic. It's all these things. It's like, yeah, it's like if you want to be really authentic and go way back to the origins, then do that. But then I hear people come back with, well, but the church improved it basically. So now it's better the way it is, in the 1962. And why would we go back to doing it? I'm like, well, it's just whatever bolsters your argument in your mind.
Well,
It doesn't have to be historical or rational. It just has to agree with you. And that's why they pick up on Bishop Schneider and Vigano. They're like, oh, a prelate who says something I want to hear. So then he's an authority. But if, there's prelates all over the place that are saying things totally the opposite, like the Bishop of London just came out with a written statement saying, the SSPX is not in the church and you may not attend their liturgies. And I mean, totally put it out there. Well, they're not going to go ascribe to that because he's not saying what they want to hear.
You're absolutely right. And the other problem too now that we have to deal with is that Bishop Barron apparently allowed an SSPX mass in his diocese to happen. And that was the propaganda came out right after the news of that whole thing. Father Z was the one who spread that story, actually. The Father Z's blog. Some people may be familiar, some may not be. So you have that whole issue, and then with Bishop Snyder, I think he means well. I just think the problem is that he's just very sympathetic to the SSPX, it seems like, and I'm not going to try to speak for him. I don't know him personally, so I don't want to. I'm trying to be careful with that whole. I don't want to assume too much with him, but there's a whole bunch of things happening, like we're talking about, that are reinforcing the or I guess the ultra trad, if you want to call it that narrative, plus the SSPX's narrative. And then if this motu proprio that's coming up actually happens soon, that's going to be a very, very interesting day when that all happens. I guarantee you that all the major, apologists for the Sedevacantist, the SSPXers, they'll be out having podcasts that day, like an episode that day will happen.
Oh,
so it'll be like breaking news, But that's something that is going to be another headwind for people like us that are trying to say, okay, look, this is actually the Catholic Church. The Novus Ordo rite was approved by Paul VI, who was a true pope. And they're forgetting that he has the authority to do that, to introduce a new rite if he wanted to, which he did.
Oh,
and Paul VI told it. He actually had a couple Wednesday audiences back in November of November of 1969, where he's kind of explaining, okay, well, this is what's coming up. We have a new mass. And he really believed at the time that having the vernacular used in the liturgy was going to really help out with the liturgical participation of the faithful, right? And these are the Vatican website has these Wednesday audiences. They have them out there for anybody to read. But it was also sort of like a funeral, so to speak, for the Latin Mass. I mean, he was kind of writing like a eulogy almost. Say, well, hey, look, we love the Latin Mass, but we can't do this anymore. We have to try something different.
Right.
So,
I mean, the church is a mother, and she only does what is best for us. So this whole thing, even about, I love it, all the hype about the motu proprio that hasn't even come out yet. So people are already getting in a snit. And then it's like, wait a second. Okay, again, we're back to the issue of trust. And if the worst you can imagine, it seems, is that the Pope could suppress the 1962 completely. So it wouldn't be available anywhere. And all you'd have in the Roman rite, legitimately, would be the Novus Ordo. But it's like, you still got to trust that if that happens, God is going to equip your soul to handle that transition. You may not be able to imagine it now, or how you could possibly endure that, and how you will, ache to be deprived of something you loved and valued so much. But it's like, it's not up to you, because this is God in control, and he's in control of your life too, and everything that you need. So it sounds kind of too simple to just be like, oh, just trust and don't freak out. But at the same time, it's like, you gotta maybe start praying now to grow your trust in God, because it'll be so much easier for you. Whatever happens, he'll help you over all those bumps, and you won't have to, bed down and start panicking and like, what am I going to do? What are my alternatives? And well, you go to the Eastern Rite. I mean, not everyone has that available to them, but it's like, if you need something to help you transition, I mean, I expect a lot of Catholics would end up transitioning rites to the Eastern, because it's just, that, especially if you grew up with that more ceremonial kind of liturgy, that would be a more homey place for you. And God understands, and he's going to provide exactly what you need.
And it's good that you mentioned that. And then I actually have to give the blogger Stephen O'Reilly credit for telling me about the Novus Ordo ad Orientem Mass, because he actually attends one. It's that hybrid Novus Ordo Mass that has some Latin in it as well. So if that is an option for people, they may like that as well. It's really just what you have available to you. If the Novus Ordo Mass is all you have available, then I tell people, well, you have to fulfill your obligation, so you should go.
Right.
You don't have to love it, but just go to fulfill your obligation. I know it's not ideal, because people want to get more out of Mass than just walking in and sitting there for like 20 minutes or whatever it would take for the Offertory and the consecration to happen, but you're still fulfilling those legal requirements that are in canon law to fulfill your obligation. So the Eastern Rite, I was very lucky. There's a whole bunch of them in Pittsburgh. So I was very fortunate with that. It did help a lot, because one thing that I think was really good about it is a lot of Western Catholics, they don't have a good understanding of the East at all. Like they just think it's the Orthodox Church and that's it. Like they don't even realize it's actually a Catholic church.
It was ours first. Thank you.
So, it's unfortunate, but because the churches look very similar to an Orthodox church, they think, okay, this is Orthodox, right? But it's not. They actually say the Pope's name many times, actually more times than they do in the Novus Ordo Mass, to say, hey, we're in union with the Pope. So they're publicly saying that in the Mass, his name many times.
That's cool.
To differentiate, to show you that, hey, we're not the Orthodox. And it was actually a really fruitful journey for me because it was nice to learn more about the East and their customs. There's more of a mysticism in the East that they have, just a very different sort of approach to confession, at least for males. I don't know how it is for females, but when I go to confession in the East, you're not actually behind like a silk or like a screen or anything. Like you're actually just sitting in front of the priest in a chair, like having a conversation like you and I are having, basically. So it's a little bit different in that regard.
I've heard that they really make it spiritual direction more than just like sacramental express confession.
Yes.
The Roman Rite is so good at keeping things brief when you need them to be brief, but a lot of people need more than that sometimes. So
yeah, and I actually thought it was interesting that approach because it's more conversational, it's more personal, I guess you could say in a way. Some people don't feel comfortable telling a priest or confessing certain sins in front of them. I'd always encourage them, if you have a different parish that you can go to just for confession that isn't your normal priest and you don't feel comfortable, go to them.
It cracks me up when we have a visiting priest, how long the line is. It's like, oh, y'all came because we have somebody different today.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Some people just feel more comfortable with that. But yeah, if you have those options like the Ad Orientem or hybrid Novus Ordo Mass, as some people call it, I encourage you to go.
That cracks me up too, okay? Because the whole hybrid Novus Ordo thing, like that's not even a thing. The Latin Ad Orientem Novus Ordo is the ideal of the Novus Ordo and has always been
just
since
Latin,
its inception.
Right?
It's like it's presumed in the missal itself, even in the all English missal, that the priest is facing the altar, like facing away from the people, because it's always saying like he turns and says this to the people, he turns and says that. So you're like, oh, if he was looking at the people all the time, that wouldn't be, it's obviously a permitted thing to be facing the people, but that became the norm. It wasn't ever intended to be. So the Ad Orientem is still supposed to be the standard that most people would experience. It's been weird that actually hasn't happened for the most part, but it's coming back definitely, because more of the priests that are being ordained now, they're really kind of more liturgical nuts. And then they're like, oh, well, I want to know about this. I want to do it right. And they're really passionate about it. And so they do more research, and then they're more willing to kind of try these things on, because the older generation of priests that were maybe the more liberal, or like they were most affected by the ideas, the misconceptions about what the Vatican Council intended for the liturgy, because of, liturgists giving them, propaganda or taking advantage of the situation. They believed that and they thought they were doing the right thing, but they actually weren't. Then they got really stubborn about it. And it's like, well, we're not going to get anywhere with you guys beyond this. So, but literally most of them are not even alive anymore. And so that's what I see. I'm in a diocese that used to be very liberal, and it's now, I haven't met one funky priest that's come in the last 10 or 15 years. Like they just want to do what the church does. They just want to know what's right, and they're open and they're eager. So that's, I would say, everyone else I talk to would agree that is the majority of the case. So we're set to see a real shift in things being brought back to what they were always supposed to be, but got derailed for a period of time.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I'm actually excited to hear that because, unfortunately during the 70s and the 80s, you had some priests that were kind of going off the rails a little bit with the, I guess, liturgical abuses is how people, how they say it, with like these hybrid masses with like guitars and, polka masses and all these different things they were trying to do. It was, it got a little out of hand,
Yeah, right. It's true. Yeah. And people were not educated and the information wasn't as available. And the priests, the seminaries were in transition and some tumult, but they've really settled down. So things are just a lot more stable and better. And yeah, then the Latin, I mean, the parts that are common to every mass are supposed to be in Latin. They don't have to be, because the vernacular is permitted for the entire liturgy, but it wasn't like ever said that that should be the standard. For certain things, they do like it to be like the readings and the responsorial psalm instead of the gradual. Like the gradual still permitted, in Latin and the original chant, it's always a valid option. But they're like, but ideally we'd like to see everyone doing the responsorial psalm, because it's more scripture provided in the vernacular for people to meditate on and participate in. And that's really interesting from the angle of just how much of that liturgy stuff I've been able to get into as a sacred musician and read. The thought behind, it's like they're kind of, processing all this in these documents that followed Vatican II, and then they're released little by little while they're instituting the new reforms. And so you kind of see that that evolution and how it came to play out. But it really helps you, because you're like, oh, I get this. Like, the church is being careful. She has a lot of good plans. And, yeah, it doesn't always come out perfectly, but it's on its way. So you don't have to be hopeless, because it's really getting better. And the more people that stick around and, encourage their priests to do that and pray for that, and support by their presence, it's going to help it happen faster. It would have probably brought this day about faster if they hadn't segued out of the church into these little groups, decades ago.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. And, unfortunately, we had Archbishop Lefebvre and, Francis Choucard, who founded the CMRI, and these other guys out there that kind of just did their own thing and were, touring, the United States, in some cases, Europe, kind of spreading their messages of independent Catholicism. But yeah, no, I think it's really good that you brought that up, because a lot of people just think that there's no organization to any of it. They just do everything on a whim. These changes all happened out of nowhere. Even though Paul VI had public audiences to talk about, what's coming up, so it wasn't like they actually rushed it as bad as people like try to portray it. They try to make it look like it happened overnight,
Yeah.
But they tried to. I think they tried their best. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just agreeing with you.
Oh, sorry. Oh yeah. So I think that's okay. I think they were trying their best to integrate it as fast as they thought that they could have, but maybe perhaps they should have waited a little longer or did it a little bit slower when we look back in hindsight. But at the time, they didn't know like how this was all going to play out. They didn't know that you were going to have an Archbishop Lefebvre situation happen. They didn't know like that a lot of these things were going to happen. So I think if we look back on it all, especially as Pope Benedict mentioned, like he actually said that it was actually a disaster with how they did the integration of, the council's will. He actually said that, he wanted to kind of make it right, with Summorum Pontificum, in talking about the extraordinary and the ordinary form. And I think he really tried his best to kind of bridge those two together as best as you could in that, in the situation as Pope, where you have, two groups that look like they're really different, but they're not that different actually. Because everyone wants to make us like aggregated. They want to make us like separate, but we're actually all Catholics. I mean, we're all just Catholics. That's what it comes down to. And there is no Novus Ordo church, is what I'm going to tell people.
Right. Yeah. So, there's one church and you're either in it or you're not in it. And that church is a Catholic church. So yeah, all these terms that are just extraneous, like, traditional Catholics. I just had to answer a comment on one of my videos by someone who said, Pope Pius X commended people for being traditionalists. How can you be saying that that's not something to strive for? And I said, well, it's not the same thing today that Pope Pius X was talking about back then. And like now it stands for this whole movement that questions the church and holds many things in suspicion or won't accept them, period. And they're doing it in the name of tradition, but that's completely untraditional for a Catholic. And they want to be called traditional or traditionalists because they feel the need to be distinguished from the rest of the church. Well, that's an indicator. And
I'm guilty of that. I'm totally guilty of that. I was one of them at one point. I was one of these people that was out there like looking down on these other Catholics, and I had to let go of that pride, so to speak, and trust the church. It wasn't a quick process, obviously. Getting back into the church and accepting that these were things that were legally promulgated by true popes.
Right.
The Sedevacantists they'll say no, they were never true popes, but we know I don't agree with them obviously now, but it's very easy for people to fall into those traps, though, because of the narratives that are out there and a lot of the information that's online. That's the other problem. You have so many of these comparison charts between, Vatican I, Vatican II, and these other councils that people have put together to support their narratives. And at the end of the day, I had to let go of all that and just say, you know what? I'm in the Catholic Church now. The Novus Ordo Mass is a legally promulgated Mass. It's, you can go there, fulfill your obligation. And that's really it. I mean, it's going to be hard for some people to come to that conclusion, but that's really the truth. That's what I had to learn. And, I had to let go of that trad pride, I guess you could call it. And, to say, you know what, I'm moving on. I'm going with the church. I'm not going to stay in trad world anymore. Even though I love tradition in many ways, I still love tradition in many ways. I love Gregorian chant. I love Slavonic chant in the East. Those are good traditions and good customs. But
if we're going to talk about tradition, let's talk about all of them. Everything that we're privy to as Catholics, whether it's from another rite or our own. And really get to know what that means, because of course we should love tradition. It's one of the three legs the church stands on. So that your experience is so encouraging, I think, to people, because you've only been out a year, right? Basically a year.
Yeah, basically a year. I mean, as I mentioned to Dom and Dr. Salza in that interview, just for a quick recap for those who missed it. It was a couple years where it actually took me a couple years to really go back and forth in my mind, and reading about the differences between the Novus Ordo rite and the Latin Mass, and then trying to kind of go through this whole maze of, it's like a mental maze of people that want to tell you that, okay, it's not a legal Mass, it's not promulgated by a true pope. If you're a Sedevacantist, they're going to say that. Whereas the society, I actually think they make it harder for them, their position, because they're saying, okay, well, he was a true pope, right? And he had the right to make a Novus Ordo Mass, right? But we think it's inherently evil still. We think there's problems with it. There's dangers there. That language, they use danger, right? And I had to deprogram all of that out of my head. And I mean, that wasn't a quick process at all. You kind of, it's like waking up from a bad dream almost. And you're like, okay, wow, I can't believe I was actually really believing in this stuff, Yeah. So I encourage people, just take your time with it. If you're trying to move away from the trad, the ultra trad world, and you're trying to go back into the Catholic Church, it is a process. And, I really loved what Andrew Bartel told you in his story about it, his experience, because it is a healing process. You're actually healing your mind to say, okay, well, this isn't evil, right? This isn't a new religion at all. It's just the Catholic Church as it always was. It's just they made some changes to try to adapt for the modern age, basically, for modern man. Paul VI makes it pretty clear in his audience is why he's doing what he's doing. Now, whether you agree with if it was the right move or not, that's a different opinion. But, we as lay people don't have the authority to really even judge those acts of authority. We have to trust the church. We have to go along with, the church has to guide us by the hand, right? So I tell people, this is not a quick and easy process to go through. That's actually one of the reasons why I'm really excited about trad recovery being around, because I think for a lot of people it's going to be easier for them to cope or navigate through these rough waters of kind of making that transition back into the church. And I'm excited to be helping you out with that, of course. And my best advice, you mentioned prayer, right? I prayed a lot through that whole ordeal. I mean, I was just begging God. I'm like, please just guide me to the truth. If I'm on the wrong side of the truth, I'm sorry. Okay. I just want to be a good Catholic, just like a lot of people do. And, I had to let go of that trad pride, like I said, to really get over that hump, just be accepting. Acceptance, I guess, is the key word here. Acceptance of the church, what the church is allowed to do legally and what it has the authority to do. You have another issue that I just want to mention real quick that we have is there's a lot of guys out there that are good apologists, but they have these PhDs and they think because of having a PhD that actually makes them an authoritative figure in the church, right? They kind of come across as these people that think, okay, I have an audience of, let's say, hundreds of thousands of people, right? So they actually think that makes them an authority in the church, but it doesn't. They're just lay people like you and I. They just have a higher level of degree of education, but that's it.
Right.
They don't have the authority to declare anything. So I think people need to remember that. They need to remember that when they're going through all this and listening to these people out there. I mean, some of their opinions you may agree with, but at the end of the day, they're not priests. They're not bishops. They don't have any authority to say anything on behalf of the church.
Right. If they're coming into variance with magisterial teaching, even ordinary magisterium, then it's like, well, who do we listen to? It's a pretty open and shut case, because it means that somewhere they missed the boat somewhere, and because the church is the sure guide, but this person has no guarantee. I mean, it's kind of crazy, like the cult that's grown up around Lefebvre, his person. It's like he can be a rule of faith to this whole group of people. They feel okay just being like, well, what did he say about it? What do you, like, that's their theology. That's their, catechism. It's like, what did Lefebvre say? And it's like, he had no guarantee of, integrity from the Holy Spirit. Like he was a bishop, but he wasn't set up to be, the sure guide of the church. How can you ignore 5 popes and just listen to him and think you're going to be okay? I mean, and then like you say, it goes with any of these other apologists, and people get like that. And it's got to be kind of intoxicating to be that person that everyone's listening to, because you're like, oh, wow, like maybe I do know something, or I mean, how could you not be affected by that? But then it makes you even more vulnerable to error.
You're right. No, you're absolutely right. And I think, unfortunately, it does feed into some of these people's egos that they actually speak on behalf of the church, and when they really don't. And Archbishop Lefebvre, it's, always, we have to mention him because he's a central figure in the whole story. He unfortunately, he was a good theologian to some degree, but now when you look back in hindsight, you think about, okay, he actually wasn't as good as he thought he was. And I think that's part of the problem. Archbishop Lefebvre even, I think, was inflated by his own members in the society, treating him as like this mini pope, so to speak. He was kind of like a mini pope, leading the society. And we have to remember, he was suspended too. He didn't have the authority to do anything. The society should have had, they actually had to go to their local bishop in Econ, Switzerland, to get permission to do anything. And then they were suspended, right, by Paul VI. So he didn't have the authority to be doing anything they did. So I think his own ego was inflated because of the people that thought that he's this authoritative, this great archbishop that, was in Africa, that, he spoke for the church, right? So he's a cult of personality among trads. And it's unfortunate that Archbishop Lefebvre was wrong on a lot of things. Sacramental intention, which Mr. Salza and Dom went over recently. He was wrong about that. So unfortunately, he was wrong about quite a few things.
Right. Well, I'm curious, while you've been processing all this stuff, if there are certain books or resources that you found that really helped you kind of find direction and sort of concretize some of these thoughts that you're having, that you would recommend to people?
Well, True or False Pope was obviously a key book that played a part in my story as far as changing my mind and, getting me to give everything a second look. John Salza did a fantastic with Robert Sisko on that book. And there is a second revision coming up at some point. I don't know when that's going to happen, but, but John's articles on the True or False Pope website are very critical, I think, for a lot of people. He didn't get to put those in the book because at the time when the book was published, he was still a part of the Society of St. Pius X.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Yeah. So a lot of the material that he's done afterwards was not in the book originally. So I'd encourage people to go out to trueorfalsepope.com and read his articles. But another thing we have to briefly talk about too, and I don't want to forget this, because I did mention Mr. Stephen O'Reilly from Roma Locuta Est, if I'm saying that right. That's the name of his blog. He was actually out there and did a fantastic job where he was combating the Benedict is still Pope theory that was starting to really spread to a lot of people before he died. There were a lot of people like Ann Barnhart and others out there spreading this, Patrick Coffin. And you have, thousands of people out there that were, praying for Benedict during their mass instead of, saying the prayers for Pope Francis. They're praying for Benedict, thinking he's the true Pope, right?
Oh man.
So we can't forget that group either. That was
Right.
becoming a problem, but unfortunately, Pope
Yeah.
Benedict passed away in January this year, and that whole movement seems to have kind of been subdued or on the verge of possibly dying out at some point. But yeah,
I was wondering
I think it's gonna, I mean, they're still out there. Dr. Mazza, who was a big figure in this, he's a friend of Anne's. He's out there still saying that, he still really believed that Benedict didn't resign properly and that he's still the true Pope, or was still the, he was the true pontiff. And I guess I'm guessing they're going to think that a conclave has to happen. I know that guy from that fake brother, he's a fake brother from the blog from Rome. Brother Bugnolo is his name.
Oh,
not the Diamond Brothers, because they're Sedevacantist. Brother Bugnolo is his name. He's not really a brother, by the way. He was never a true brother when you look into his history. But he was out there, and then he actually had a so-called conclave at a hotel in Rome, in this conference room. And, it was actually Stephen O'Reilly who reported this, that the conclave result was that Pope Francis was elected Pope.
What?
So, you had this guy out there saying for years that Benedict is still the Pope, right? And then he comes after Benedict dies, he has this so-called conclave. And, unfortunately, I think there's some mental issues there with this guy. But it was funny because he said for years, Benedict is the Pope and Francis is a fake. He's not the true Pope. And now all of a sudden he's the Pope, right? They elected him Pope at this so-called conclave.
Okay.
So, but Miss Barnhart and others, they were distancing themselves from this guy, saying, "Oh, he's crazy." We don't agree with his conclave, and it just adds more confusion out there. But the reason why I bring it up is Mr. O'Reilly really did a fantastic job of refuting these people's position, and he doesn't really get the credit that I think he's due on not only the articles on his blog, but the book that he wrote. And I encourage you. It's out on Amazon. It's called Valid with a question mark, and then the case against the Benny Papists, if I remember the title of the book correctly. I did read the book, but that was a few months ago, and I go through so much material that I don't even remember some things half the time. And being a dad on top of that plays into this. But
sleep deprived.
Definitely sleep deprived. I can tell you that. My son woke us up the other night, at 3 a.m. So you get it as a parent. But anyway, I didn't want to forget mentioning that, just because that's just another issue out there where people are confused. And I'm hoping, I'm praying that these people come back into the church. They accept, Francis was the legally valid pontiff, even if you don't like him, let's say, with what he's done in regards to the Latin Mass, or, the confusion about Amoris Laetitia and some of these other things that happened. He's still the legal valid Pope, and, no one has tried to issue any sort of dubia or correction against him since Amoris Laetitia happened, and that whole thing kind of fizzled out anyway. Nothing really came of that. So anyway, I'd encourage people to obviously pray for God to guide you back into the church. If you're on the fence and you're like, hey, you know what, I don't really know who's right about all this. This is a mess. And you have an Eastern Rite church around you, I encourage you to go to the Eastern Rites, because you know what? It's actually nice because you don't actually have any of these sort of debates going on in the East. You just go there for Mass, get to know the parishioner, and that's it. There's really no mention of Vatican II at all, at least in my experience.
Yeah.
So
I feel like we're going to have a generation of people that have been raised with the 1962 are just so attached to it that they're going to have to sort of get by that way. Like you're saying, it's like, I want to be in the church. I'm going to hang on as well as I can, but I kind of need this to get me through. And once that passes, it won't just keep being like that forever. I mean, we won't just keep having generation after generation.
It's an ancient right.
Yeah.
You're right. You're absolutely right. Sorry, I wasn't trying to cut you off. You kind of did almost disconnect it for a second, but you're back.
Oh no.
It's okay. It's not your fault. But yeah, because it's a more ancient rite, more traditional liturgy. I think it would appeal to those people. I have to agree with you on that. But if, let's say, the Novus Ordo is your only option, like we mentioned, go to the Novus Ordo if you have to fulfill your obligation. Don't be afraid to, even though it's going to be awkward for you. I get it. Being former trad, I get it. It's going to be really awkward for you to go back in there because you've been programmed to think that this is bad, right? Yeah. But it's been given to us by the church. It is not evil. It is not bad. And I have steady friends. If they're watching this, I know they're rolling their eyes right now. They're probably losing their minds right now with me saying that. But that's the truth, and that's something we all have to accept. And as tough as it is to stomach it, you have to accept that the Novus Ordo is a true mass of the church. So yeah. But yeah, anyway, that's just a bit of my story, and I don't know if anyone has questions that they want to ask, or if you have other questions, Laura. But that's kind of I guess the quickest recap you can do in an hour here.
I think that was great. No, I really appreciate everything you shared. And I think it's also testament to the fact of how profound the propaganda, how profoundly it affects people, because you were raised with the Novus Ordo. That was normal to you. And you didn't know anything else until later in life when you came upon the TLM and traditionalism. And then you're like totally swung the other way, like totally averse to it. It's like they're really effective at being able to convince people. And like you say, when they're passionate and, excited about what they believe and, conspiratorial or, fear-ridden, because fear is it's a very animating force. It's negative, but it's, it really kind of keeps you buzzing. And yeah, it's obviously so hard to pull out of that, even though like you're now going, wow, that was really unhealthy. Like I have to unpack so much of this. I know, some people are super helped by going to counseling, because it's not just in the realm of doctrine. Like it affects you on an intellectual, emotional, psychological level. Like, I mean, you studied psychology. I'm sure you have insights into that too, from your own experience and your knowledge of how that works.
Well, yeah, and that's why I say frame. I said frame earlier, as far as telling people there is no Novus Ordo Church. This is a new frame that I want to really start to get out there, and if some people don't understand what framing is, psychology, it's really just kind of like a backdrop to explain something. I guess that's the simplest way to explain what framing is, to kind of shift someone's viewpoint on, what are these preconceived notions that they have about something, right? Like the Novus Ordo Mass, for example, is a good example, because everyone that in trad world has been taught it's bad, it's evil. It's inherently, you have priests that say it's a black mass. I mean, there's guys like Father Jenkins, who's a Sedevacantist that has a podcast. He's out there calling it a black mass. So what I'm trying to do is, I'm trying to use some of that, I guess, training, if you want to call it that, or stuff that I remember from, my college years, to say, hey, you know what? It's time for us to shift the narrative. It's time for us to change people's viewpoints, or at least try to change them, on what the Novus Ordo actually is. It's the Catholic Church. It's not a separate church. It's not what Archbishop Lefebvre, I have to give him credit. He did a fantastic job of convincing people that this is a different religion. This is a different church. He reinforced that narrative, that frame. He was really good at it. You have to give him credit where I guess it's due, but he didn't do it. It wasn't good for souls though, but he did a heck of a job with that. And the society, they, like you said, they just go and repeat whatever he said, and he's their rule of faith. And I really want people that, if you're coming out the trad recovery, take on this mindset of, okay, you know what? This is the Catholic Church. There is no Novus Ordo Church. It's just a Novus Ordo rite. That's all it is. That's it. That's the truth. There's nothing more. It's that simple. That's all we have to say about it,
That's great. No, it's so good. Thank you. There is a guy in the chat here.
Okay.
He says, first he says, I think I know you, Dan, from my experience in the Sede circle. You look familiar. Then he says,
yeah, I remember you, Carlos.
Oh, wow, I do know you, Dan. Thanks be to God. We're both home now, brother. Our journeys are identical and we crossed paths. I can't wait to reconnect with you.
Yeah, and Carlos, I'd wonder what happened to you, by the way. You kind of fell off the map there, and I was worried about you. I sincerely was worried about you, and I'm glad to be seeing you right now. It's because I actually met him at the Sedevacantist mission that's done once a month out here. So
Okay.
Yeah,
This
we'll
was
have a
his
long chat
question.
soon, Carlos. We'll reconnect. Don't worry.
This is his one question. How did your Sedevacantist community and friends react to your departure from the position?
I'm glad he asked that because I was going to talk about that briefly anyway.
Oh, good.
Unfortunately, I lost some of them as friends. Some of them don't want to
Mm.
talk with me anymore, and I expected that. That you'll remember Travis, who is the guy that really organized that whole mission out here. Travis and I, we go back a few years. I hope that at some point we'll talk to each other again. The door is always open on my side. If he wants to reach out to me and talk, but unfortunately, I did lose some friends from the mission. And it's tough, to lose any friends that with people that you really care about.
Yeah.
But I understand why they're doing it. They think that sorry, that's my father that walked by. He has Parkinson's, by the way, so and he's deaf, so he didn't actually hear any of this.
Oh, man. Darn.
Yeah, sorry about that. I didn't know that he was going to come out right now, but that's okay.
It's good. That's good.
But yeah, so unfortunately, I did lose some friends over it, and I keep praying for these people. Every time I'm at Mass and after receiving Holy Communion, I actually do pray for the mission people. I pray for everybody that's on the fence, even people from the SSPX that reached out to me after my interview with Dom. And I hope that someday I can reconnect with some of these people. I pray that they'll leave those groups. But a lot of them aren't going to, unfortunately, because I know, just based off of my discussions with some of those people, that they're set. They're set. They think this is the truth. They're comfortable with where they're at.
That was my mic.
That's okay. It's okay.
Going over. Sorry.
So yeah, Carlos, we'll reconnect. You still have my number. I think I still have your number. So yeah, I'd love to talk with you. I encourage you to come out to tradrecovery.com as well. Also. Yeah, no, I completely understand where you're coming from, Carlos. And we had some great discussions, after we were introduced at the mission. So we'll reconnect for sure.
He just
I'm proud of you too, Carlos. I'm proud of you too.
And this is the last one. See, you guys, you have so much in common.
The Eastern rites helped me so much. I figured that would be the case because you don't have the Vatican II discussion at all there, really. I mean, they'll briefly mention it, but there's no ongoing debate there because they don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, right. No, it's kind of like a shelter. I know people too that once they left the society, they were just like they did accustom to the Novus Ordo, but it was pretty traumatic for a while, just kind of getting used to that. And then they found a local Eastern rite, and they were kind of like, "Wow, I can just rest here."
Yeah.
And even though it's in the vernacular, it cracks me up. But I mean, it's like it's still in so many ways similar enough to what they were used to, or in certain aspects of it. But yeah, it's like it's okay. I can hear English, but I just need to have some of these other things and not these throwbacks to things that were so programmed.
You're absolutely right. And sorry, I couldn't help but notice Carlos's comment there. And Carlos, just so you know, I wasn't actually trying to pull you back. I don't know if you ever got the one voicemail from me, but I actually was genuinely concerned. I actually thought something happened to you, like you got hurt or maybe you were in like an accident or something like. So anyway, we'll reconnect. But yeah, I wanted to address that comment really quick.
Oh, you're good.
But yeah,
he's been very dedicated in the chat over here. You're the only one, Carlos.
Wait, Carlos, I'm also happy that he's a fan of Laura's channel. I actually was a fan too before coming on, so I'm actually honored to be a part of having an interview on here.
Oh, I'm so glad you came on. It's just you have so much to share, and that I can just get to ride the wave. I let you talk, I ask you questions.
Yeah,
maybe. I just love giving you the airspace because you need to be able to share this with people, and it's great that we have a platform like this we can do it on.
I'd encourage you to even bring Carlos on at some point if he's comfortable, because Carlos, you're a very talkative guy, Carlos. Like you could easily do an hour on here, I think.
That'd be great.
That would be interesting to see him come on, and maybe even other people that come on Trad Recovery. We'll see if they're comfortable doing that. But yeah, no, I'm happy to hear that, Carlos, and we'll reconnect for sure. Awesome. And I'm really grateful to Laura for bringing me on, and maybe in the future, Laura, we could talk about my whole invalid marriage situation. That was
man, I know. I think that would be good for people too to hear. Yes, we'll have episode 2.
Yeah, that would be great. And, I really appreciate it. I'll keep you in my prayers. I'll keep everybody, listening in my prayers, of course, the people at the mission, Sedes, SSPX people. But yeah, let's remember there's just one Catholic Church. There's no Novus Ordo Church. There's
Yeah.
just the Catholic Church. So
Awesome. Well put. Thank you so much, Dan. I appreciate you a lot, and I'm just grateful that it worked out for you to come on, and we'll do it again sometime.
yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. All right. God bless.
God